two massive real estate companies, Evergrande and Country Garden. This is how the story goes. Back in 2021, Evergrande missed two bond payments and for the last 2 years has been trying with all its might to regain its footing. Now fast forward to August 9th of this year, Country Garden, the other massive real estate company, misses a bond payment and is given a 30-day grace period. Fast forward 9 more days to August 18th of this year, and Evergrande, the company that defaulted on 2 payments in 2021, files for Chapter 15 bankruptcy in the United States. The question is, Country Garden, which is 4 times larger than Evergrande, will it be able to make its payment or will it miss its payment on September 5th, which is the end of its 30-day grace period for its bonds? And if it does miss, what happens? Let's talk about it. My name is Derek and I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. Let's get right into it. First and foremost, this story is complex and there are a lot of moving parts. I made a video on the real estate crisis that is going on in China a couple of videos ago, so I definitely recommend you check it out. What I want to focus on in this video is what happens if Country Garden does in fact default on its payment. So first and foremost, Country Garden is 4 times larger than Evergrande. Evergrande already failed, already defaulted, and already filed for Chapter 15 bankruptcy. Country Garden, being 4 times as large, will have much more implications to China's overall economy. The other thing you have to understand is that 30%, roughly, of China's economy is tied directly into real estate. So what happens in the real estate sector affects the rest of the market. Now, Country Garden is given until September 5th to pay its bond. This is what's known as a grace period. Now, the company is fighting frantically to extend that by 40 days. What this signals to me, and what it should signal to most people, is that if a company is trying so hard to get an extension for 40 days, it means that most likely if that extension is not granted, it will miss its payment on September 5th. And the other thing that you have to understand is that this is not a principal payment. This is a roughly $22 million interest payment. So if a company as large as Country Garden is struggling to meet a payment that is about $22 million, which sounds like a lot, but it is not when you account for the fact that this company has close to $300 billion in outstanding loans. $22 million should not be much. So what we can, I guess, the inferences that we can make from this is that it most likely will miss its payment if September 5th comes and it does not have a deadline. So what does this mean for the real estate sector in China? What does it mean for the economy in China? And more importantly, what does it mean for the world economy? And presumably, if you're watching this, you're most likely in the West. So what does it mean for Western countries? Well, first and foremost, the reason why these companies are struggling is because the real estate market in China is having the complete opposite crisis that we are having here in the United States, which is one of extreme house prices. In the United States, housing prices are going up and up and up. In China, the complete opposite is happening. We are actually seeing deflation in the real estate market. Now, this is for a multitude of reasons, but it can be traced back to the pandemic. And the fact of the matter is, during the pandemic, and we're still feeling its effects, people did not have the same ability to generate income. And when people's incomes go down, so does their ability to buy real estate. On top of that, the youth in China is estimated to have a 20% unemployment rate. And if you include people who have just stopped looking for jobs, the estimates are closer to 40%. Now remember, as youth matures, they buy houses. So the youth it's kind of their, I don't want to say responsibility, but it's kind of looked upon them to buy real estate and to continue to move the housing market in the upward direction. That is not happening. So because of that, real estate companies are not able to sell developments. So you have Evergrande and you have Country Garden, which are flat in the middle of this, plus about 40 to 50 other smaller real estate developers who have begun to default. They are not able to sell, which means that they are not able to make money, which means that they are not able to pay their bond repayments. And on top of that, the assets that they do hold, for example, Country Garden holds 4 times as many projects or assets as Evergrande did. All right, those assets are worth less, so they have a harder time borrowing against those assets to basically refinance their debt. So all in all, they are struggling to make their bond payments. Now, this is where we can start to answer the question. What happens to the real estate market in China and what happens to the rest of China's economy? There is this thing known as contagion, and that is what everyone is worried about. If you have a massive section of your economy, in China's case, that's 30% that the real estate sector makes up for their GDP. If you have problems in a sector that massive, you may have contagion spread to other markets. The reason is because even firms that have nothing to do with real estate have investments into the real estate sector. For example, investment firms. There are investment firms in China that have direct ties to the real estate sector, but those investment firms may also loan to other markets. This is what's known as shadow banking. I did a video, my previous video is on shadow banking. All of this is interconnected. So, because of this interconnectedness and because of this heavy reliance of China on the real estate sector to generate 1 in 3 of every single one of its GDP dollars, there is fear of contagion. If the investment firms that have massive investments in the real estate sector start to fail because they are not getting paid, right? Because if the major real estate developers in the real estate sector cannot pay their bonds, some of those bonds are owned by investment firms. If those investment firms are not being paid, they can then not have the money available to lend to the other sectors of the market. Tech, agriculture, production of goods, the things we are more accustomed to talking about when it comes to China's economy. So if you have a lack of funding in those other ventures, in those other sectors of the market, that is then called contagion because you can start getting a shrinking of the entire economy of China. Because if there is no funding, people cannot fund ventures in other areas of the market, and you have a total shrinkage of the overall GDP. Now, China is not there yet, and I am not, and I want to make this very clear, I am not calling for doom and gloom, and I do believe that China, being the second largest economy on the planet, has safeguards in place, and the government will step in if necessary to bail out the economy if it goes that far. Now, all this is speculative, and it all hinges on if and when Country Garden pays their debt. If they make the payment on September 5th, no problem. If they get an extension and then make the payment, no problem. And even if they miss the payment, we have to understand that it is a $22 million interest payment. There are ways to restructure that, and they may be able to negotiate with their bondholders, which they are currently doing, to find a better structure for them to be able to pay. The fact of the matter is these problems are coming from the real estate market because the real estate market is finally, and I don't want to say that, I don't mean finally in a good way. I just mean after decades of growth, the real estate market is finally moving in the opposite direction. Over the last 20 years, China and its real estate sector has grown and has gone up. And that is why companies like Evergrande and Country Garden have been able to skyrocket in value as well as continue to borrow money and not be affected. Most people, if you and I borrow too much money, we are negatively affected by that. But if the industry that we're in keeps going up and our assets keep going up, we can keep borrowing. And that is exactly what has happened. Now in 2020, a massive pandemic happens and those real estate prices start to come down, and all this stems from that. So if Country Garden does miss a payment, or in a worst case scenario, just like Evergrande, in a year or 2 years from now, files for bankruptcy, that is where we may have problems. Now remember, these are slow-moving things. Evergrande took 2 years from first missing its payment to filing for bankruptcy. So if Country Garden follows in the same path or a similar path, we're talking a year to 2 out. All right. At that time, there are many things that may happen. The real estate market may start to increase again. Real estate demand may start to increase again. The Chinese government may retract its 3 red lines, which is a policy limiting how much debt these real estate developers can take on. It might retract that and start injecting fuel back into the economy. There are many things that can happen. But if all things remain the same and Country Garden goes down the exact same path that Evergrande went down and does end up defaulting does end up filing for bankruptcy in 1 year or 2 years, that is going to have rippling effects through the rest of the economy. Now I want to talk about something that is very closely related, which is investment firms. There is, and excuse me if I mispronounce this, there is already an investment firm known as Zongrong, and I apologize if I butchered that name, which has already missed one of its payments to its investors. Now, this company is an investment firm, presumably part of the shadow banking sector. Shadow banking is basically lending money when you are not an actual bank. It is legal and it's totally fine. It's just the people who are funneling the money into the company are investors, not depositors. But that is why you're hearing things about shadow banking and the crisis that may move into that. But it already missed a payment to its investors, and there have been protests outside of its office to get paid. So you're already seeing some contained contagion. So you're seeing some spread, but it seems to be contained, and it does not seem to be rapidly spreading. I guess the analogy that I'll use, or the mirror picture that I'll use, is 2008 in the United States. You had a domino effect, and you had Lehman Brothers implode, basically, and you had a domino effect that cascaded down the market, and you saw major repercussions for the better part of a decade. That does not seem to be happening, at least not currently, and the contagion does seem to be smaller. But think about it like any sort of, when we use the word contagion, it's very similar to a pandemic, right? It starts small and it seems contained, but if it gets out of hand, it can cause major repercussions. So that is the big concern. All right, we will have to wait until September 5th to see if Country Garden restructures its debt or is able to pay on its debt or gets an extension. All right, now what about the West? Okay, what happens to the West? Well, first and foremost, we have to understand that directly into Chinese real estate, the West does not have much direct investment. It is sub $500 million. So it's not even $500 million. When you look at the entire United States GDP, that is barely nothing. When you look at the entire West as a whole, European Union, etc., it is barely a drop in the bucket. So we do not have any direct, we're not going to feel any direct effects if massive events like Country Garden going bankrupt happens. The problem is if there is contagion and that slows down the entire Chinese economy, that the West will feel, because production of goods will go down, because overall money supply will go down, because everything will shrink. Because again, the economy nowadays is not a singular economy. It is not the United States economy. It is not China's economy. They're all interconnected, and it is, in a sense, a global economy. That is also why, completely unrelated, but when Russia is hit with sanctions, it hurts, because it cannot self-sustain, and most countries cannot anymore. Everything is interconnected and everything is tied. So if China catches a cold, the rest of the world will as well. There's a very common saying that says if the United States coughs, the rest of the world catches a cold. That is because the United States is very strong, and you presumably have worse effects in the rest of the world. China is the second largest economy, right under the United States. So if China if China coughs, the rest of the world may catch a cold, especially the neighboring countries that are heavily reliant, mostly Asian countries that are heavily reliant on Chinese infrastructure. So I hope I didn't ramble too much. I'm going to give you one more final synopsis. Evergrande defaulted, and then it went bankrupt. Took 2 years. Country Garden defaulted, but it still is within its 30-day grace period. It is currently trying to restructure its debt to try to get a 40-day extension on its grace period. Regardless, that is not a good sign, because one, it means that September 5th comes around. If it cannot restructure, it will most likely default. Two, if you're already having problems, a company that large is having liquidity problems on $22 million, which for the size of the company should be pennies. If you're already having problems, liquidity problems at such a small level, even if they figure out how to pay this, what happens when the full bond repayment takes place? Or what happens when other of its debt matures close to the end of the year, which it is supposed to? What then? How is it going to pay those things? Is it just simply putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound, basically? I don't know, but that is the fear, because if it is struggling with such a small dollar amount, it is most definitely and most certainly going to struggle with larger dollar amounts when that happens. So that is the story up to now. What happens in the future? Well, Country Garden either defaults and files for bankruptcy, it doesn't do either, or defaults and does not file for bankruptcy. I think the major picture and the more important thing to take away is that the real estate market, not necessarily the company Country Garden, but the real estate sector in China is having issues. And because it is such a huge portion of the Chinese economy and its GDP, there may be contagion. And if that does happen, then you get an overall slowdown of the Chinese economy, which can spread to the world. Now, when you have consecutive economic shrinkage, that's known as a recession. So, All in all, could this lead to a recession? Perhaps. What are my thoughts for the coming months and say for a year out? Well, what I think is going to happen, and I'll just be blunt. If we look at what has already happened, I think that Country Garden is going to default on September 5th because it is going to do everything it did, everything Evergrande did, and Evergrande still defaulted. So it most likely will default. Maybe it doesn't. I think then there's going to be a very slow period where Country Garden tries its best to regain its footing, exactly like Evergrande tried to do for 2 years. Then I think that unless there is government intervention, or unless there is a change in the real estate market, which means that asset prices start to go up, as well as people's income and their ability to afford those real estate prices. We're talking China here. Unless that happens, I do think that there is an inevitable bankruptcy in Country Garden's future. Do I think it will happen? I think it's too hard to tell because I think it'll be at least 1 to 2 years out, and I think that the Chinese government probably understands that Country Garden is too big to fail. With that said, everyone thought that Evergrande was too big to fail, and as of last week, it did. So we will see how the Chinese government handles this, and then we will see what happens in a year timeout. But during the meantime, if everything just goes in the direction that it's going with zero intervention and the market does not change, inevitably, Country Garden will file for bankruptcy because you have asset prices that are low. You have its inability to generate income because no one is able to buy the houses, and you have an oversupply, which is causing deflation in the real estate market. So that has to change to be able to save Country Garden. Country Garden does not fucking matter. Country Garden is in the spotlight right now, but it is representative for the entire real estate sector in China, and that is representative for the entire economy of China because it is a huge portion of that. And that is representative of the global economy because they are all interconnected in that order. So I hope this video was informative. I hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoy these discussions. There is plenty of content on the internet that is extremely edited and that is extremely, chopped perfectly. What I want to do here is something different. I want to have discussions with you. These are one-taked. I don't want to say they're one-taked. I mess up. And it takes a lot of research to do these videos. But once I get going and I talk with you guys because I think it is important to have discussions. It's called personal finance for a reason, and I do think that it needs to be personal. So if you like personal finance, if you like world finance, if you like economics, and if you like investing, you are in the right place. My name is Derek, and I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. This stuff has been my passion for over a decade, and I love being able to share it with you guys, and I love being able to give you my perspective. So if you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so. It does help the channel immensely. And don't forget to turn on the bell notification so you don't miss the next video, which usually are on Tuesdays. Sometimes when there is a major world event, we'll do a video on Thursday or Friday as it's happening, but they're usually on Tuesdays. Other than that, I love you guys. Stay well, stay happy, and continue learning personal finance because it is the cornerstone to your financial future. I will see you in the next video.